Hello everyone, today we talk about Domitian's government. This is the first video about the Flavian dynasty that some of you asked me, with insistence, which was wholly, understandable given that we hit almost 2,000 videos uploads, but in fact, the Flavians really didn't take part in this avalanche yet, and of course, what hasn't come up yet has more chances of coming up sooner, right? Just simply as that from the topics extraction. Today we talk about Diocletian's government in those aspects that reflect a continuity with the previous forms of government, not just the one of Domitian's brother and father, Titus and Vespasian, but in general also with the imperial policies, and we will, of course, look at also other aspects that are more dissonant, right? But I plan to make a video explaining which aspects, right, brought Domitian to another direction compared to the previous trends. Unavoidably intertwined, already from Domitian's government, if you're familiar with the character, at least perceived, because there was a pretty bad press, papyrus writing against this emperor that was not just assassinated, but also suffered a damnatio memoriae, which of course precluded us, as it's usual in this case, is an important degree of knowledge about a figure that was evidently a conservative one. It was also more authoritarian than his reigning relatives. This aspect is quite fascinating because Domitian essentially saw himself as a benevolent autocrat of some sort, and he was actually a very capable ruler. In many ways, he stabilized the empire, he consolidated the frontiers, he was pretty much into taxation, tax regulations. He was very watchful over the provincial governors. He was taken out in part because of this, the fact that he put to death or exiled different senators. That the Flavians had constituted a discontinuity compared to the much more sort of, traditionalist Julio-Claudian ultra-elite, right? The Flavians had humbler origins, but power is power, and Domitian, who rose to the throne, in fact, as a real monarch, as the fact that the principality was and was ever more becoming, wanted really to rule, right? He had been left aside by his family until that age. He had not, we don't even know whether he had a formal military training, whatever. There are lots of voices, again, gossips against him, because he had a difficult character of some sort, that we're not going to discuss, because I plan to make also another video about the Domitian the Tyrant, ? Because always of the senatorial dichotomy, the aspect, of course, of a ruler that tries to concentrate power ever more, even as far as the senatorial governments in the province, that we see that there are a lot of, at least, there is an opening compared to what the Flavian dynasty had done up to that point, that was essentially bringing as many close relatives, supporters to governmental functions. Instead, right, Domitian opened to provincials, which was actually a less conservative way of operating, but that matched with some of the most effective, in fact, imperial policies, because it kept up with this capacity of cooptation and exploitation of talents that were not just from the very center. Under Domitian, especially the currency reforms were quite successful. Nero's denarius reform had been extremely successful back in the day. Domitian, by the way, married the daughter of Corbulo, right, the famous general that succeeded in Armenia against the Parthians, etc., in Nero's times. And it seems that the denarius in most of Domitian's reign was almost entirely, like 98%, whatever, silver, which actually matches with Domitian Meticulov's attention for the currency at the time. He's a very interesting ruler, right? He's perhaps, I think, in pop culture mostly remembered for the let's say the relative lack of success with the Dacians, at least the appeasement policy against Decebalus, and so in contrast with Trajan, that instead conquers Dacia for good. But it's not even entirely about that, right? The Romans were ultimately successful against the Dacians in the containment policy as far as also defeating them in open field. But there were, of course, some reversals, including at a point the loss of the Praetorian eagle standard, which was, pretty ignominious objectively. But as we will see in the end, lots of other issues on the frontier were sort of settled. When Domitian was assassinated, actually the army was pretty grievous about it, because he had been a somewhat capable strategist, even if, again, gossips say otherwise. But the attitude of the military after his demise is quite telling. He is normally credited, as far as the imperial strategy is, assuming there was a broader one. There's a very Lutvakian concept that we should, at least in this categorical, systemic, structural orientation, a bit dilute. I should make a video about Lutvaks, the great strategy of the Roman Empire. Also one of the Byzantine one, for that matter, but that's good for a book review. For having fortified, especially the Germanic so-called limes that did not even quite exist at that, he rearranged basically Germania in the two provinces, superior and inferior, and he is credited normally for having began to to fortify better, to sort of increase the defensive capability of Rome. And so this would have allegedly been the proof that Roman legions were more on the defensives. It's just a mild beginning of the end in the catastrophistic sense. This is actually not correct. It may have played a role to some extent in the local military administration with Saturninus' revolt. We will see it now. We don't know what the grievances actually were in that case, but let's not explain it now, but it's definitely not that simple. The Roman legions, of course, maintained always that sort of aggressive strategic mentality for which, on the Rhine, on the Danube, they were there not to much defend from the external, but for keeping under those who lived on both banks of the major riverways. So, and effectively so, still at that point, right? Domitian himself celebrated a triumph against the Catti, styling himself as Germanicus himself. And we will see it a bit better now. I made, back in the day, a video about the Battle of Mons Graupius that occurred under Domitian, under Agricola's command, as you know. And Domitian would be actually the one to call out the occupation of Caledonia that had been accomplished, because in his view, also as an administrator, emperor, there was nothing to gain for Rome there. It was just a waste of money fundamentally, but of course, that has nothing to do with the military potential of the Caledonians. And at some point later on, at the beginning of the 3rd century, were literally wiped out by the Romans, and apparently that's how the Picts began. Made multiple videos on this. The one about Mons Graupius is actually one of the few I still have to re-upload, and that are currently blurred because of the pictures issues. But if you want the explanation of the battle, at least from an audio point of view, it's all there. As you know, all my material is available publicly for free. So let's observe these some of these aspects, just as a basic introduction to, again, these aspects of continuity in Domitian's reign compared to his predecessors. In fact, this is the point. In an essential way, Domitian's, I said Diocletian at some point during the video, I hope not, but that's a lapsus, of course. Domitian's government doesn't differ much from the one of Vespasian and Titus. All right. Institutionally speaking, because this was relevant. For example, the ordinary consulship. Domitian obtained 17 in all, and 7 before he became emperor, right, in 10 lead. So he had himself conferred in 85 the censorial powers, essentially for life from the following year, right? A perpetual censorship. He is acclaimed imperator 22 times. He celebrated 3 triumphs that we will see later. And he was surrounded by capable figures. Domitian was a bit of a follower to some extent. His friends were definitely close to him. There's still a Flavian continuity, and partisan presence. Right, even after Domitian was assassinated, Nerva was basically elected by the Senate shortly after, but it was plenty of Flavian supporters all across the empire. And the men he surrounded himself with were good ones, good counselors, good advisors. He preserved substantially Vespasian's entourage. He adopted for a long time the same attitude towards the Senate of his predecessors. Eventually, he got instead a bit more oppressive, and again, he took out multiple senators and this, were exiled. Others. Domitian was very, had a very moralistic attitude to his imperial rule. He renovated certain laws on morals. He was convinced of the necessity, of course, of maintaining, reestablishing the full traditionalist view of the Roman archaic religion, and it's very interesting how he sort of leads that in a way that maybe we will deepen at another point. Domitian was a great builder, right? He is estimated to have earned 1,200,000 sestertii for the empire every year, normally. 1/3 of which would be devolved to the maintenance of the army, and a good part of that to the building of important structures, the completion of others, started so famously by his relatives as they had been in power. Right. Needless to say, the Flavian amphitheater that he completed with a gladiator school, you can immediately see just up next to the Colosseum, the famous Ludus Magnus. Titus Baths, the temple of the Divus Vespasianus at the capital Thete. He restored the same capital, and especially the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, notably enough. He also restored the Campus Martius. This area had been devastated after the fire of 80 AD. Furthermore, Domitian developed further this building, this great building policy. In particular, he undertook the ark of his brother Titus, the temple of the Gens Flavia, that reinforced, of course, the concept of sacred monarchy. This temple is on the Quirinal Hill. The stadium of the Campus Martius, that is famously enough corresponding to today's Navona Square that has the typical stadion form, and these were also flooded historically to perform naval battles there. In fact, that's part of the legacy. The shape of the square is unforgettable in that regard. Domitian also built between the Forum of Augustus and the one of Pax the so-called Forum Transitorium, so the one that fundamentally connected the two. The Forum Transitorium would, however, be inaugurated under Nerva, considering the Damnatio Memoriae, that there is a lot of art actually. It's that Domitian had started, and there was famous reliefs. For example, the ones of the famous Chancery Palace reliefs that had started by Domitian and were simply restored, adding Nerva's face instead of, in fact, one of his predecessor. The most important building is, however, the Domus Flavia on the Palatine Hill, that is basically the largest ever built, and it also stands out as it is not just the imperial palace that occupies all the central part of the Palatine, but that reunited for the first time private residence and official palace of the gens, right? And this definitely shows, in all its eloquence, the monarchic, absolutistic mentality of Domitian, the elevation of the gens Flavia to basically the highest level, also over the Julio-Claudian one. That is all mirrored in the same architectonic style and symbolism and so on. We just list these things without further detail, but we will see it hopefully better in some other video. Right. Now, provincial administration. This is really important because, as we were hinting at before, Domitian enhances dramatically his control on provincial governors, right? And as Suetonius, in his Life of Domitian 8, tells us how, also oppressively the ruler would do so, right? Suetonius writes, Domitian put so much effort in repressing the intrigues of the provincial governors that these never showed themselves to be, to lack interest, to be unjust, right? While Suetonius comments, we have seen a great number after Domitian accused of all crimes, right? So, in other words, in spite of the generally bad press that Domitian suffered, this was due to him, that he had managed to instill fear, right, and respect in this elite in their provincial mansions, and this would go to actually the benefit of the local administration. And it seems, as a consequence too, that this was not the normality. Notoriously enough, the Romans had established a system for which the emperor controlled fundamentally the most strategically relevant areas as a sort of personal domain. Then the private senatorial houses were given this provincial tasks in sort of more economic areas where they sort of used and abused, and that yet were important for the general economy of the empire, right? And such harshness from the side of Domitian against such misdeeds seems to have been one of the major reasons why eventually the Senate turned against the emperor. As always, like, it's a leitmotif. You can have different stories, different anecdotes, but at the end of the day, it's always about the struggle between central power and the peripheral one. But in an elite level, it is all the basis which Rome rested in practice. We find Domitian intervening pretty much in provincial life as well. He stayed abroad for long, right? You can argue that already at this point the Roman capital laid where the emperor's court was, right? Of course, yes, in a general geographical and urban sense, Rome was the uncontested center of the empire in practice, also in material, in practical function. But Domitian had this care for the different residences as well, also admittedly close to Rome, but that essentially detached him from the urbs and rendered him ever more occult. There are some correspondences with Tiberius, honestly, both characterally and this fact that he was sort of a ever more distant, right, recluse, different to approach, right. It's also a precautionary measure, given also considering how the latter's end went. In any case, Domitian pursued actively the updating of the cadastre. He sort of regulated the different issue of the subsequiva. That is, essentially, he rendered to the owners those land plots that had remained unassigned, hence the subsequiva, after the divisions among the veterans. This was an old issue. We will see it better at some other point. The centrality of the cities was, of course, enhancing a more cardinal, robust central control, right? On the other hand, Domitian also takes a lot of very punctual measures to improve the provincial welfare, right? Also, perhaps on an imperial scale, to harmonize certain production, right? He, again, so involved in administration, was probably aware of the necessity of favoring certain type of crops, certain type of, again, goods production for the general profit of imperial economy. So he favored, of course, inter-exchange among the periphery, within among the provinces, the peripheral regions of the empire. And this all went together with this iron fist against corruption. For example, a former governor of Baetica, so today's southern Spain and Andalusia, was accused in 93 of embezzlement, of fraud, and more. So that he was, this guy was condemned by the emperor to pay an indemnity to the damaged provincials, right? There is an inscription in Pisidia that exposes the measures taken by a governor to counter speculation and ensuring the provision, let's say the local population grain supply to a fair price, right? This was also what normally, again, this corruption was about, speculating on local resources, say at the detriment of the local subject communities. There are some edicts, for example, on viticulture. We do not know exactly when, possibly 92, and the ultimate goal of these would have been, but there is a big historiographical diatribe about it that I'm not going to descend on, to reduce that part that was taken from the wine in order to increase the cereal production in Italy and in the provinces as well, and in order also to defend the income and the value of the large estate owners, after all, which was also Roman economy was based on, and so couldn't be hampered by some sort of oppressive governorship, just per se, bad administration. Finally, but we're not sure about this, it's possible that the curatores of the cities were established as an official figure by Domitian, right? These guys were essentially functionaries entrusted with the task of solving, say, the local city issues. So again, care towards the city, towards the markets where eventually all these products were exported from, could reach the same Rome and other parts of the empire. So making things work smoothly, right? Reducing corruption. And we see again from the currency that this activity helped Roman economy a big deal, right? This guy was a great balancer, right? It's likely that the stability of the 2nd century AD Roman Empire stemmed from the recent Domitian's administration, management of Roman economy, and therefore it's yet another plus. Coming to the frontiers, the empire is in an important phase of consolidation. The time of the Great Conquest is not over, as Trajan would prove with Dacia and Mesopotamia. But in general, as far as especially as Central Europe is concerned, like the Rhine frontier and the Danubian one, in spite of the latter's widening later on, are fundamentally settled. And there is yet, however, some pressure coming, some movement coming from the other side. It's nothing particularly worrying in itself. The Dacians, again, making most of the trouble, and we'll explain why later. By the way, together with other peoples, right, supporting her in this. There is Britannia as well, that has not yet entirely been controlled, territorially speaking, in a direct way, right? The policy that Domitian adopts throughout his life, meaning that, if he hadn't been assassinated, likely he would have changed things, was also the one of continuity, was one of containment, especially of the Dacians, right? Against whom he would have launched a further campaign right after the settlement. We'll see now with Decebalus that also was apparently and strongly resented in some Roman milieu, because it seemed like inglorious, right? Not worthy of the Romans. It would have simply had to subdue the entire country, right? Compared to what the Flavians had already done, Domitian puts also pressure on the Germans on the Rhine. He launches a campaign into several tens of kilometers into Cattian territory. We'll see it now. The agitations caused by Decebalus' Dacians also prompt him to intervene there. But for the rest, he is also a preserver, as we were noticing before. We'll see now better with Britannia. Like the concept was, yes, let's scope what there is out there, but let's not expand, right? Domitian was not particularly fond of this expansion, probably not because of ideological reasons, probably pragmatic ones, right? When we look at these boundaries, we realize that there was just of course, a price to pay for further expansion. Some of these lands were not, had not been envisaged, like either that they were too remote and primitive, like Britannia. Other areas had, as we've seen with the Danube and the Rhine, had been stabilized, like since Caesar's Augustus times, basically properly in the imperial intention, like this had been left properly by the two Julians, as like, okay, let's stop there. Like, let's settle for direct control only from this side of the rivers, because it's just the easiest thing. We don't lose much if, on the contrary, we risk to actually pay more if we occupy lands outside. There is all, I would say, an obvious correctness of this evaluation, of this assessment. I've never made a video explaining how and why the Romans decided to stop there. There are some what-ifs out there. a fan of what ifs because I think that history, the way it happened, is much more interesting and challenging itself to research, to inquire than things that literally did not exist. I mean, what happened in history is reality. What is there more interesting than that? If not just saying, well, okay, if that battle had been lost, what would have or won? Say the outcome had been different from reality. What could have happened, sort of predictably, in the immediate aftermath? Like, that's something you can do, but you can't really pretend to alter, say, our understanding of world history and how things would have been. Like, no, right? We have already stratospheric issues with history, the way it happened. There is no way. It's a fruitful endeavor to lose your own actual and serious historical time in what ifs. It's just a major misallocation of resources, to say the least. And this is actually what dictated the same strategic decisions. I mean, von Clausewitz is quite clear at some point, explaining that the idea of a certain strategic move does have a practical strategic effect, because it does bring people to behave otherwise. And so in this decisional process that is notoriously difficult to, in fact, to scope, and that's why I was criticizing Luttwak before, aside from, you know, the works that are not terrible, but just they have this evident bias that you can't unsee, and that you always must contextualize strategic thinking into the times. I mean, in Latin there is not even a term for strategy, right? The Romans just knew what they had to do, and with means, methods, and theories that, albeit largely unknown, are just self-explanatory in the way they established the most important empire in the history of mankind, the most successful military in the history of mankind. Now, Britannia. Now, Agricola had been pushing towards the north from a while. This continued under Domitian, right? The Roman general occupied a very wide part of today's Scotland. He built a legionary camp on the Thaid, the one of Inchtooth Hill. He defeated the Highlanders in the Battle of the Graupius Mountain. And again, I made a video about that. It's a very interesting battle, by the way, because the Romans won hands down, at least to say it better, the Batavian allies, right? Destroyed the entirety of the Caledonian army. The Britons didn't really have particularly high military quality. Actually, they were the worst of the Celts. The Caledonians are a bit more of a mysterious people ethnically, but let's be concrete, they were basically the same thing. And the Batavian auxiliaries that these are, you know, around the same time of we've seen also in the series about naval warfare, Civilis revolt, etc., were pretty tough, right? Where the Germans with the Batavians were a Germanic tribe that was basically straddling to an important extent of service, Romanization, and but also further, you know, dwelling across what we call the limes, that the Romans didn't really call like that. It was more the concept of munimentum, so how much, you know, certain area was provided with troops, as opposed to the geographical concept that is just a 19th century delusion as such. It's about projection of divine God-given power, right? Just if you wonder how the Romans saw that. But they were, in this sense, again, a bit the underdogs of the situation. They were among the most primitive peoples out there, but the Romans offered them, of course, great advantages through military service, the citizenship award, etc. So Agricola had these troops with him, and they took down the entirety of the Caledonian army. Chariots, infantry, but mostly that army really was. The Caledonians are an interesting people because they are actually the only one that developed some sort of decent cavalry in all of Britain, which is fascinating because the Celts as a whole were sort of more, the Celts proper, like the Britons proper, were more developed military-wise, but Scotland, and this is true also for Pictish warfare, I made multiple videos about that, did maintain some sort of more feudal profile that allowed them to field some more decent cavalry proper. We're talking chariotry that they had, like including this battle. In any case, they grappled all together in this enormous mass on the foothills of this Graupius Mons, and that doesn't inspire much strategic advantage. The Batavian auxiliaries basically made a massive bath of blood. These guys that were basically the largest force that Caledonia could put together, also the only one, basically, at this point. A reason for which Agricola manages to make the entire tour of Scotland from the north together with the fleet, with his fleet. I made, incidentally, when I was 14, a tour of Scotland by car along the coast. It's fascinating. I landed in Newcastle, and then from there, but the other side, I went up to Liverpool because we're a bit of the Beatles fans here. My parents, at least, were exactly from that generation. I did visit Hadrian's Wall as well. Nice memories, but just for saying, like, literally, that the landscapes are amazing, as you can imagine. And there are vast areas of wilderness as well. Scotland is even if it's painful to say for a medievalist somebody who was interested in ancient, medieval and modern Scottish warfare, at least today, Scotland is a civilized country. It wasn't up to a few hundred years ago, but there are truly many areas that are like, if it wasn't for the road you're driving on, like, you look around, you say, this hasn't changed at all from the time beings, and that sort of, it's difficult even to describe it. It's as if there was some strength that in this desolated area was emerging from the land itself. There's something mystical and dark about that, and sort of gigantic and sinister at the same time, that maybe is the same feedback that a Roman legionary would have had from these expeditions out there among these peoples that were just like, imagine terror attacks all the time, ambushes, guerrilla, etc. But again, that's the best at the end of the day they could do. And of course, the Romans had the easy military potential, as this expedition really proved, to conquer Scotland. It's just that there wasn't much in Caledonia that you could really find. And this seemingly was a debate that was going on at that point, because Agricola was recalled by Domitian, and apparently other, say, the military would have liked to continue actually with the occupation, right? There are forts, in fact, that the Romans bail out from. There is archaeological evidence of, including the one of the Thay, the major one. Domitian decides that this land cannot give Rome a profit, really, so it's useless to occupy. Nothing much is going to happen from the other side. Yes, you'll think about Hadrian's Wall later as, stemming who knows what, but did these major infrastructures were mostly for supporting the army and blockading, mostly these infiltrations of raiders, etc. It's a bit like the North African limes, right? It was a bit of a different concept. Hadrian's Wall, of course, justifies an important ferocity and military potential from the other side, but it's not, let's say, that hallmark of defensive and passivity of the Roman army at all. Like, this was just the board out of which the Romans could, in fact, and would launch massive retaliations on the Caledonians, to the point of literally wiping them out historically. Like, at the early 3rd century, the Romans destroyed these people. They cancelled it from history. Their descendants were still there, but they were something else. right? They decided to call themselves something else. They decided to rethink themselves in different ways, and it surely did leave up an important mark in Pictish warfare as well, like in the experience matured against the Roman legions. So this, let's say, the end of these expeditions, this is the point, sort of pacified Britain as such, right? Caledonia will remain out of the empire, but this was likely for the best, right? Again, there was not much of a need to permanently occupy it, and Domitian was likely right, also his successors, evidently. So talking about Germany, Germania, a Germanic people, the Catti, it's a famous one among the Western Germans, installed, in fact, on the Taunus Mountains, threatened and disturbed the Roman foundations in the Rhineland and the Wetterau Valley. Right, the Germans were not essentially a particularly dangerous people either. Right, we are far from the times of the great confederacies, migrations, whatever. The Romans had stabilized again their frontier, keeping them under. Right, most Germans interacted peacefully with the Romans, were fundamentally subjected to them, even if Rome did not occupy most of the land across the Rhine. But of course, the internal agitations between the Germans that were very fragmented at this point did bring these tribes, in many instances, out of desperation due to its need of survival, accumulating enough wealth to preserve themselves in a politically unitary sense, to harass, in fact, the Roman frontier. So Domitian launches two campaigns, right? The first one is the most famous that we mentioned before, is massive. It's directed in 83 by the same emperor and completed by pacification. Let's use this beautiful term in the Roman way, expedition. Right, we do not know how much it took, but a few months, because Domitian was back to Rome and he celebrated a very elaborated and complicated triumphal ceremony. Basically, the Romans launched a deep dive into Catti territory and kept, hammering them down in their usual, brutal fashion. Right, when you hear the phrase, they made a desert and called it peace, well, we know archaeologically that the Romans could do that, and would do that, especially in these areas where there was practically not much to gain, if not, again, slaves, some loot, etc., but it was mostly about bringing these guys down. And objectively, it's a bit difficult to see some problem with this, also in a moral sense. In 89, you have another expedition that is into Germany, that, however, is not triggered by a German revolt, but actually a Roman one, the one of Saturninus. Right, it was a general that had rebelled and on the frontier and made an alliance with the same Catti that, as you can imagine, were not very happy with what the Romans had done to them, and were searching for revenge. But essentially, the Roman rebels and the Germans failed to join forces because of a thaw on the Rhine that prevented the Catti from crossing into Roman territory. As a consequence, after only 24 days from the rebellion, Domitian had put down the Roman leaders he brought that had rebelled. He brought the two legions that had rebelled specifically to the Danubian frontier and put to death ferociously at the heads of the rebellion. And he also launched retaliatory raids into Germanic territory among the Catti, right? And there are major consequences deriving from these expeditions, politically and strategically. First of all, it is at this point in Roman history, by Domitian, that Germany is organized in two provinces, Germania Inferior and Germania Superior. Right, inferior in the north, the superior in the south because of the Rhine course. It's a bit. This is we've seen it also in the Middle Ages. Like northern Germany, also at the time was wilder than the south. That more or less had some. First of all, had historically been Celtic, but that's not much the point. It was just closer to civilization historically. It had more connections with the same Romans. And again, most Germans at this point were just neutral or even allies with the Romans. There was a lot of cooptation of Germanic elites, etc. Also among those who at some point rebelled. This had been the case of the same Arminius back in the day. But again, it was a wider area. The Romans controlled de facto what happened on the right bank of the Rhine. That was in part also directly controlled by the Romans upstream to Mogontiacum, today's Mainz, and this amount of, in fact, of Roman-controlled territory increased under Domitian towards the north and the east to form, famously enough, what would be, in fact, the part of Roman Germany known as the Agri Decumates, the area of the Black Forest between the Rhine and the Danube that were united to Germania Superior, and that historically, this is one of the reasons why actually Domitian expanded in this territory is the limit of the wine, right? It's the idea that the Romans managed to expand into into this area because it is notoriously, from a climatic point of view, the warmest in Germany. It allows to grow wine, and it helped as such preserving, thanks to some substance derived from must, the preservation of large amounts of cereals that were needed for supplying the army. Not only, there were broader, of course, political and strategic reasons. This is just anecdotally, deterministic and materialistic as an information, but it had to do partly with this, this climatic areas of Europe. Like from there, Central Europe, in a concrete sense, begins also climatically, and this affected the local agricultural output. The Romans again did not need to push further in this area, and also this frontier would be firmly militarized. This is what Domitian, in fact, is also famous for. He starts perfectioning the local defense lines that start assuming properly this continuous, almost at least continuous, perimeter, which was actually a defense in depth, as always. Like, there were different ditches, palisades, walls, watchtowers, etc. And that essentially started from Koblenz up to around the surroundings of Stuttgart, looking at the modern names, the modern settlements, and they of course were aimed at providing with some extra, productive land and securing especially this wedge stuff in it, between the Danube and the Rhine, right? So the connection between the two rivers were safely ensured, and this was particularly important also for the properly trade the riverways. The Romans, as you know, had also some flotilla. I have as part of the local permanent forces, I have a bit about the ships of the Classis Flavia Moesiaca, right, incoming, and this all contributed to the idea of Romans that sort of yes, in some cases even re-expanded, sort of stopped and began to dig in and entrench and fortify rather than being able to push further. But the reality is that, of course, these fortifications alone, like any fortification, doesn't have any strategic value. It's only your military that gives a strategic value to it. So this was just a support system, infrastructure that helped preventing raids, that facilitated the deployment of the troops for projecting even hundreds of kilometers into enemy territory. And the Roman legionary and auxiliary deterrent along the Rhine, the Danube, was the greatest safety that Rome could have in the first place, and was working pretty damn well, right? This would be evidence also in Trajan times, where lots of troops were brought also from the Rhine frontier, participating to the invasion of Dacia together with their armor depots, etc. And let's say the system worked magnificently, right? But speaking of Dacia, in fact, that's the most interesting part, of course, in Domitian's military history. So in this sector, what you see is historically, from the Roman side, a lesser care, right? And the reason being the fact that the Germans, even though more primitive than the Dacians, were sort of a fresher stock. They were many, they were concentrated and pushing. So the presence on the Rhine frontier, given that the Romans also conquered as de facto Central Europe Gaul pretty early on, Caesar, had he received, the Illyricum instead of Gallia Cisalpina, would have actually gone for Dacia rather than Gaul, Transalpine Gaul. I made multiple videos about at least the Gallic wars. In any case, that continuous Rhine frontier that basically separated mostly Gaul as a whole, Belgica, from Germany, had been a precociously strategic and strategically relevant theater. And so the Romans would always maintain a concentration of troops against the demorally loaded Germans. Right, the Danube was a much more fragmented area. I made a video about the Roman provinces in the area of Moesia, especially. I made a video about the Skordiski, a Celtic tribe that dwelt basically in today's Belgrade, Singidunum, that the Romans knocked out. But in fact, there wasn't much of a broader population that was threatening simply as a whole the Romans there. The same Dacians were exactly in virtue of their greater political advancement, some sort more of kingdom, even though they were fragmented enough. There were different tribes, different groups within them. Their heartland was surrounded by the Carpathians. There were relevant mineral resources there. That is what eventually attracted the Romans to settle there permanently, and also because, again, the mountains provided with some sort of natural boundary. This wedge projected also among other peoples we will see now that there would be a bit more squeeze likely to invade other areas of the empire. The Roman province of Moesia was basically the only truly productive one along the Danubian limes, and Dacia was immediately north of that. So in order to stabilize the former, you would have to conquer Dacia. That would remain essentially a military frontier, right? It underwent some significant Romanization. I made a video about Priscus, the take on post-Roman Trans-Danubian Dacia in late antiquity, explaining a bit this also as far as the Romance presence in today's the Romance languages in the Balkans in Central Europe still are in connection with that. But this had, as a sector, as a broader region, had remained, however, more politically fragmented. Again, in the east there had been the Thracians that had been brought down at the time of Claudius. There were essentially the Celts all around. They had some point descended from the Danube and partly influenced the local peoples. Towards the Adriatic, you had the Illyrians. And in the north, you had the Dacians, these Jaco-Dacian peoples. Further north, you had the Germans. In the west, the Iranian peoples, like the Sarmatians. In the east, so and just across the Danube, aside from again the resources of Dacia that had been, especially thanks to its precious metals, always been trading with the Balkans, with I don't know, the Macedons back in the day, etc. They had been sort of more civilized. They had been closer to civilization, and so developed with some sort of greater political compactness. But overall, right, especially outside the Carpathians, that's not even. It's just that they're wild places, but they're actual steppe, right, to a large degree. So there's really not much. Right, Germany is more profitable than that. In any case, the same Roman proximity to Dacia had brought the local rulers to, again, compact their political capacity and military capacity, to concentrate forces, to have a sort of greater control on the territory. And at this point, to sort of harass the Romans. Right, the Julio-Claudians had not needed to intervene against the Dacians. Particularly, they had been able, due to the political fragmentation, to use diplomacy effectively, and also transferring populations here and there. That the Romans, in Moesia, we've seen it, deported lots of groups depending on their allegiance. Some parts that were military colonies, etc. Same Romans. They had managed the thing in that way. At this point, instead, Dacia was compacting, and so times had changed as well. You perceive this also in their enforcement of the limits. It's just like with the Germans, they had gradually undergone some Romanization, and as such they had become more evolved. As we've seen, they fought in the Roman armies. They were close to them. There was a greater exchange along the Rhine, in this case also with these other peoples along the Danube. Rome was a major, to say the least, emanatistic powerhouse that would osmotically and magnetically attract these more concentrated population, say polities in this case, and also the other peoples gravitating around her. Explained far and wide the ecumenic nature of Rome. We know, again, this remarkable thing that the Romans didn't even care about the geographical existence and awareness of today's Russia, but we have, Roman artifacts up to the Urals and to some relevant degree. And of course, you understand that those peoples did know pretty well what Rome was, whereas the reversal was not true. So here, one has always to start from the actual power ratios, dynamics, proportions of the time. So the organization of the Dacian nation, supported by nomadic peoples, come from Eurasia, the Sarmatians with their different groups, transformed the political balance along the Danube. Right, the reason why the steppes peoples gravitating around these areas, and I explained it in a video from the series of Eurasian steppe warfare as far as the Sarmatians go, because this was not the only area of contact with the Romans. Of course, was auxiliary, right? The steppes peoples were objectively weaker than the sedentary ones. They could at best support, again, with their predatory behavior, this more based, territorially compact polities like the Dacian realm. And they would sort of wedge in these corridors, such as the one existing between Pannonia and Dacia, right, essentially between the Danube and the Carpathians, in the west, as well as the one between the Carpathians and the Black Sea in the east. Those, especially the latter, was the preferred corridor historically for nomadic incursions in Europe. And so, as long as you had this center of power in Dacia, you would have in an equally magnetic way, the attraction of these war bands harassing the Romans in Pannonia and Moesia, and so in areas that, as we've seen, were not particularly relevant for the empire as a whole, but that surely disturbed the stability of the entire region and could not be tolerated. So in 85, the Dacians go as far as crossing the Danube, invading Moesia, and killing the local governor. So this is the casus belli. There is a first Roman expedition in 85-86 that ends pretty badly, as we were saying before, the Praetorian eagle is lost. Right, the Praetorian prefect dies in this campaign, and during a defeat, right, inflicted by the Dacians on the Romans. There are other expeditions the Romans launch, one in 87. In 88, there is a remarkable Roman victory that brings to a sort of truce the year after. The Romans are, of course, superior to the Dacians, militarily speaking. I made multiple videos about Dacian warfare. We have to come back on that. But of course, this doesn't mean anything. It has to do with the, let's say, political commitment, the strategic situation, even the tactical one. So the Dacians play this card of being, centered close to this frontier. The Romans see this area as a sort of wilder than, of course, their Mediterranean core lands, and they must fight for something that is not immediately evident, especially if there is nothing to conquer, really, and you have to wait for Trajan bringing to the successful conquest of Dacia. Domitian yet had been thinking about it, except he was assassinated before he could launch it. It would have happened had he lived. As I explained in the aforementioned video about Moesia, this had been split in two provinces. The superior one that hosted 4 legions, because that was the hottest part, the most strategically relevant one. In fact, the aforementioned Singidunum, the connection of the Danube, of the Dacia, again a crossroad with Sirmium, other important cities that could just send the legions in multiple directions that could be vital. The Romans had problems with the Germans also in Pannonia historically, so this was all stable. But of course, during the Dacian wars, the frontier got heated up. The Germans also were observing this, as we will observe now ourselves. In Moesia Inferior, you had 2 legions instead. That was a remarkable potential. 4 legions meant 80,000 men almost, right? So altogether, you always consider the auxiliary, the equivalent auxiliary complementary component there, right? So there are large forces. We're talking about 100,000 men in Moesia as a whole. And in spite of this, the war against the Dacians did not easily stop, because also this people is sort of morally loaded. It's also somewhat organized, right? We do not actually. I made a video about Dacian warfare explaining this. We do not have actually the evidence of remarkably effective Dacian tactics that we can categorically separate, I don't know, from the one of the Celts or the Germans, right? More or less they looked the same, but there was some perhaps a bit more of tactical segmentation due to mirroring social stratification. You had this other steps components that were habituated to cooperate with the Dacian elements that had some, in fact, steps influence in their warfare, generally speaking. So there was some fuel to the Dacian, not just resistance, but offensiveness. The Roman operations from 89 to 92, they shift more upstream, upriver, against the Quadi, the Marcomanni, and the Sarmatians. This Germano-Iranian connubium is something that you will find even just I don't know, 1 century later during Marcus Aurelius' Marcomannic Wars. And so that it was basically the same dynamic. The area populated by the Marcomanni was sort of the most developed in Germany. It was fundamentally today's Bohemia, like the Boiaenum as it was called at the time. Once a Celtic land, but where the Marcomanni had managed to establish a more compact power already at the time of the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. The West Germans were considered like, easy peoples to subjugate. I mean, the Romans had conquered them pretty easily, but the real problem were the Marcomanni. Their cavalry, right, marabouts at the time, their large numbers, and so something that looked a bit more like a kingdom, like a bit like the one of Decebalus in this context in Dacia. So again, nothing that would particularly threaten the Roman presence on the frontier, but still that had to bring to resource consumption to be handled, and with reversals, as we've seen. Right. In fact, 1 legion was destroyed among these fights. The difficulty in settling this once for all, especially with Dacia, was yet to be to be established, to be started in the first place. It was uncertain, and before his death, Domitian was in fact already preparing for a 3rd Pannonian expedition to cope with the Dacians specifically. And these other peoples were a bit more like a side dish, but still, adding to the problem. There is also an eastern strategy, of course. Also here, there is not much of a change compared to previous times. Domitian, however, also in here reinforces the systems of defense. Remarkably enough, he intervenes also, however, up to east of the Caucasus, in today's Azerbaijan, as a famous Latin inscription that I also uploaded here among the pictures on a stone, witnesses in the region of Baku, right, on the Caspian Sea. So this tells you how far, of course, Roman power and projection capacity easily went at that point. Also in this case, it was about taming the locals, showing off, deterring, through, destruction, looting, subjection, and showing what the Roman army was made of. So disrupting the bases, the enemy bases, and then falling back, and repeat that until basically the guys on the other side don't give up for whatever stake you have put. So you have definitely a very interesting military curriculum by Domitian that again is really missed by the military when they learn he's been assassinated, and that therefore shows actually this proficiency. Even though again there are guys saying, he was not much of a strategist. Yes, okay, but we're talking about chit-chat by enemy senatorial milieu, right? It's just like, also as far as the idea that Rome was stopping to expand and whatever, consolidating these frontiers doesn't mean that there was a poor military understanding, or that this was a proof of weakness just per se, or that Rome was not projecting, as Trajan would show, by the way, for an actual invasion, conquest of Dacia and Mesopotamia. And after that, you have a bit of similar thing with Hadrian, right? That, as you know, bails out of some of these areas, but also was enormously liked by the soldiers. Despite he also reinforced dramatically the frontier, etc., the soldiers thought highly of him. There is someone who says that Saturninus' revolt was triggered by this idea that, yes, what were the Romans doing? Were they fortifying? Why should they have done that? They were the chosen people. Why these peoples from the other side should have even bothered them to defend from them? There was some more, of course, contingent, perplexity by those who were observing this. From the other side, of course, the fact that the Romans were fortifying showed like it was not really a positive thing for them, but it was still a way of saying, well, the Romans planned, of course, to stay, but they plan to defend more than have done before, and so that can be not just a relative, but an absolute indicator that there is a different attitude. But it's all, again, considering especially the peak of Roman power had yet to happen from at this time. Like it's sort of a bit difficult to think that this was just the proof of some alleged decay in this context. It's about Rome finding her balance in this dynamic environment, right? And this was true to an important extent also for her rivals, right? So we will talk about this because I have a playlist on Roman frontiers that I will keep uploading, but it's quite, we have still to frame the concept proper in multiple videos that I have, like about the Roman military, and I think we have thousands of videos to make at least. And it's like an evergreen in the first place, but we haven't even begun. I mean, that's actually the worst part of this on Schwerpunkt. It doesn't matter how many hundreds of videos I made on Roman history and warfare, we still have to actually deal with it, seriousness. Yeah, we haven't even begun. All right. In any case, I think these are interesting aspects of Domitian's policy, and the more conservative ones, at least compared to the previous policy of his relatives, of just the empire. There are also innovations we'll talk about another time, and then we'll have to talk about him in some greater depth in the first place. Also about his Dacian campaigns and more. Again, these are just small presentations about single emperors, their single policies, but again, doesn't matter how limited sources are to some extent, there is always something to dig more and to appreciate as far as that goes. In any case, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.